Thank you for listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I'm joined today by fellow therapist and author Jay Stringer. Jay, it's good to see you.
Adam, it's very good to see you.
We are going to talk about how our stories affect our sexuality. And in part, you're here today as an expert in this field. This is your niche, how our stories affect our sexuality as adults. And, you know, right from the beginning, I'm kind of mindful about how fraught sexuality is, how difficult and painful it can be, even though, of course, sexuality is designed for pleasure. So let's start with this, Jay. How common are sexual difficulties in committed romantic relationships?
Sexual difficulties are so much more common and broad in scope than any of us would like to admit. So let me share a few statistics. 30% of women and 15% of men report having low sexual desire. About a third of all marriages will be impacted by extramarital affairs and subsequent pain from betrayal trauma. 10 to 15% of women report sexual pain. About 30% of men report problems with premature ejaculation. Studies have shown that things like porn use can nearly double the probability of a couple getting divorced. And lest I keep going, the final one that I would share would just be 80% of women and about 43% of men report coming from some form of sexual harassment or assault in their lifetime. So what I think the numbers begin to show but can't fully name is just how much heartache, anxiety, and madness that sexual problems can create in the life of an individual or a couple. And one study found that only about one or less than 1 in 4 couples actually feel like they can talk about sex or sexual problems openly in their life. And so I think just the reality that so many of us are dealing with is that we have so little language, so little preparation to navigate the inevitable problems that emerge in committed relationships. And certainly for those that come from, a faith background of some kind, we were led to believe that things like marriage might help solve sexual problems, and yet the reality is that they often compound them, which then leads to even greater strain on a marriage. So one of the things that I'm passionate about, I know that you're passionate about, is how do we create safe and wise places in the world for people to understand these sexual problems? How do we help people to be curious about these problems? Often show us the way to healing, and they show us the way to growth.
I'm just sitting still with the heaviness of all those stats that you rattled off. And the one that haunts me the most is that only at least in this moment, is that less than 25% of us can even talk to our partner about this area of our lives, our sexuality. And if we can't talk about it, there's immense loneliness and at some level desperation and agony in that.
Indeed.
In our opinion, your opinion, my opinion, our stories in our family of origin, way back when, growing up, deeply affect our sexuality as an adult. Now, that's a claim. That's a premise. That's an opinion. So can you put some words, Jay, to why you believe this to be true? Like, how have you experienced this, either personally or professionally?
Part of what I would say is that when people arrive into a therapist's office or there's some crisis in the marriage, they normally see the present problem as, divorced or separated from their family of origin and some of the formative experiences of their life. And so our work as therapists is to really help people build that bridge between the present and the past. And until that bridge is constructed, people will often try to, hyper manage or ignore the present difficulties. But really, our work is to be able to build that bridge between the past, or between the present and the past. So personally, how did this work out in my life? Well, I had what could be referred to as an enmeshed relationship with my mom. And so the way that that would play out is that I was often privy to the difficulties that she was having with my siblings and some of the pain points that existed with her marriage to my dad. And over the years, I developed kind of a sixth sense for the heartache of her life, and then would end up adapting much of my life and my free time to bring comfort to her. So, this could be anything from conversation to going to run errands to joining her, just doing the dishes after my family would scatter after dinner. And what I didn't know then was that this way of reading the needs of women was very central to my fantasy life, would become very central to my fantasy life and the way that I would position myself in relationship to women. And so I was often the guy in college and grad school that would be kind on the surface of wanting to get a sense of, like, where was their relationship in exile with regard to their marriage or their boyfriend? Where were some of the difficulties that they were experiencing in their families or in their work? I just love to listen to them and try to offer conversation, insight, and really bearing witness to those difficulties. Well, that worked out fairly well to be able to begin dating someone. But then what would inevitably happen would be that, this style of relating that existed before I started dating completely changed to much more demand, much more entitlement, much more just meanness with regard to the women that I was dating needed to anticipate my needs in the way that I had been conditioned to. And so that was really a wake up call in my marriage and in dating, was whenever a woman would begin to find life outside of me, I would feel kind of desperate, angry to be able to get something of their life and their commitment and their energy redirected at me. And that was part of the process of just a lot of grief and therapy, was to be able to really step into, how did this, surrogate spouse role that I played with my mom, how did that factor into some of the porn that I was using back in the day? How did that factor into me suppressing so much of my needs around my mom, but then it just becoming just engulfed once I began to get into committed relationships? And so, even though no one ever likes to admit, like, my mom shaped my sexual life or my dating relationships, our relationship undoubtedly has created a lot of grief and problems in my dating relationship. So, as you talked about earlier, just when we don't have language to name and to explain part of what we're going through, that's really where the isolation and the misery begins to develop. So much of this healing journey for me personally has been, yeah, to really build the bridge between present sexual and relational difficulties to some of these dynamics in my early family of origin.
And so, just in the spirit of like particularity and specificity of linking past to present,
Hmm.
can you say a little more about how your attunement, attention, care for tending to your mom eventually translated into a sense of demandingness and entitlement in your dating life?
Whenever you have an enmeshed or triangulated relationship with your parent, one of the ways that we have talked about this in connection to the Allender Center is that role comes with both profound privileges but also burdens. And so the privileges, I would get to know first what was happening in my family. I would have the inside scoop on virtually everything that was happening in my home and even outside of my home. We would go on grocery store trips and I would get to pick out my favorite cereals or ice creams, or would often get on Christmas morning. I can remember a couple times where I'd be surrounded by 50% more in terms of dollar amount of gifts than some of my siblings. And so that sense of privilege, but also the sense of burden of, when I am in the midst of a difficult situation, when I have pain, when I have heartache, is anyone actually going to be there for me as well? And so I think just having, decades worth of no one being very attuned to me, no one being oriented around my needs and my experiences in life, that anger and that disengagement had to go somewhere. And I think the moment that I began to attach to a significant other, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like what it's like to actually have needs and to feel like I desperately need someone. And then anytime that level of desperation is not met, I think the inevitable movement of the human heart is to go from, a desire to a demand. And so I think that was really what began to play out was, just with dating and in marriage, like you need to be there for me. You need to exist for me, anticipate my needs, essentially be something of the mother, something of the father that I never had. And so just a lifetime of suppression ended up into just a great amount of entitlement.
So, in your very helpful book, Unwanted, one of the points you make is that there's always two storylines at play. There's the storyline of my present sexual struggles and agonies. And then there is the storyline of my growing up experiences, which set me up for those present sexual struggles. And your point is that there's a connection between our painful growing up experiences and our present sexual lives. These things are linked. So take any present day sexual struggle, whatever it is for the person, and you can, as it were, draw an arrow from that struggle back to particular moments in my story. And your point is that sexual harm in the past becomes reenacted in the present. That's the word, reenacted. So Jay, what do you mean when you say that sexual harm from the past becomes reenacted in the present? Like help us with that word, reenacted.
We keep recycling memories, behaviors, self states in the hopes that maybe one day it might go differently. And so one of the ways that we see this with, sexual behavior is, let's say that you had experienced some sexual abuse when you were a child. Well, you might feel the shame both of what happened to you, but also because of how aroused you felt within the context of that abuse. Well, if that story is not grieved and cared for, and some of, just the language to be able to name some of that arousal much later in life, you are probably going to recreate that trauma cocktail where you feel both a sense of arousal, but then after you feel arousal, you feel a level of shame and condemnation for what you're experiencing. As we talked about our relationships with our mothers, those things begin to get reenacted later in life. And so there's this sense of, I want to be able to anticipate the needs of very meaningful people in my life, but I also have to play out that relationship all over again where my needs actually are going to matter and I'm going to be able to articulate them. Sadly, in my case, it wasn't a kind invitation to care or to know. It was much more entitled. But that dynamic with my mom that had not been addressed was being reenacted in my relationships in the present. Your relationship to sex and to your partner is very likely reenacting formative patterns that you have not yet addressed. And that's what leads to the madness, it's what leads to the misery, but it's also what leads to the healing and growth that problems can create in our lives.
Yes. And now I want to ask you about something a little bit different about arousal in general and about shame. Because there's a great couple of sentences in Unwanted where you say this. You say, despite the overwhelming grip of shame and guilt, which so many of us feel, okay? You say, I do not believe that sexual fantasies are something to condemn. Sexual arousal is one of the greatest gifts God has given us, and we do not need to spend a lifetime annihilating it. I love those sentences. Those are prophetic, invitational, and frankly, countercultural sentences. Why, Jay, in your opinion, do many of us get stuck in a war with our sexual arousal, with our sexual desire? And why do many of us kind of respond to our sexual struggles by trying to kill that desire or manage it or tamper it down?
There are both family of origin and adverse childhood experiences for this, but I think if we go upstream, there are also systemic forces that are at work in our world. And so when we think about, especially the way that most Christians have engaged sex and desire, there's just been a lot of desire to contain it, to manage it. And so this is kind of the phrase that I use in Unwanted, is that we have settled for a lust management paradigm. And we have been trained to seek out accountability, to get internet monitoring, or for many of us, we realize that there is a civil war with desire. And anytime we feel arousal or desire, we feel a level of shame or that it's going to get out of control. And then in response to that civil war, we develop strategies to begin to suppress or to contain desire. And so I see that playing out over and over again, is that there's almost, a sense of a bulimic way that we engage desire, where I give myself over to it completely, but then I feel bad and some level of judgment for it, and then I try to purge it out through good behavior, through just ignoring my sexual life for a season. Or we just realize that if I just suppress desire, life tends to go a lot better for me. And so I see that playing out over and over again in people's lives.
As I'm listening to you, it just needs to be said, sexual desire is a good thing. Period. Full stop. It's a gift from God. It's created by God. Like, people need to come to terms with that. Your sexual desire was God's idea. And my guess is that most people listening are like, okay, yeah, I'll agree with that, but my desire has kind of gone mad, and that's not God's idea, and that needs to be dealt with, and that needs to be shut down. As I'm saying this, Jay, what happens inside you?
Oh, I feel fury that we have been discipled in that way to be able to kind of contain our desire. And I also go to, a passage like Romans 12:2, which says, don't be, conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so we could say, the patterns of this world tend to commercialize sex, try and get it to be much more of a commodity instead of deeply rooted into a relationship. I think the struggle for many of us is that we have never been invited or asked to see our sexual life as a primary place for our spiritual formation and growth to take place. And so that's just one of those places of defiance that exists within me, is how is it that people can go through decades of their life and are never invited nor asked to see their sexual problems, their sexual arousal, their sexual fantasy as just very fertile territory, fertile soil for growth to take place. And so that's one of the things that we talk about in this conference, is really inviting people to understand their sexual life as a house. And so being able to think about, just kind of imagine it's late in the evening and you feel that familiar knock of lust or fantasy or desire come from within you, or maybe it's from a partner. And just kind of that question of, what are you going to do when you feel your own sexual arousal or the sexual arousal of someone else, and you feel a level of just desire to contain it or get rid of it? Well, some people will try to put a force field up around their house. They might try and stiff arm their partner from getting very close to them. Or the other extreme would just be, you kind of let the lust, the fantasy just come into your life and you let it ransack various rooms. There's a sense of like, I just don't want to try to push this thing away any longer. I'm just going to let it come in. Part of what I would invite people into is, what if you went out onto the front porch of your sexual arousal and fantasy and just began to ask it questions like, I wonder why, whenever there is a bid for sex that my spouse makes, I feel something in me just completely shut down and I want nothing to do with it. Or I wonder why this particular porn search has been appealing to me since I was 13 years of age. And so most of us, again, either try to manage it or we just indulge it without really listening to our sexual life. And so that's, one of the hopes of what we're creating is to offer a safe place for people to be really curious about, maybe I feel like my desire is excessive, maybe I feel like I need a defibrillator for my sexual life. We want this to be a place for people to ask questions, to be really curious about why they're in the middle of a civil war with their desire.
So, for those of you who are married, it is highly, highly likely that you fight with your spouse about sex. And what I want to say or ask, put it like, is this: what if these fights that we all have with our spouses about sex are best understood as the inevitable conflict between my childhood story and my spouse's childhood story? In other words, what if understanding your story in your family of origin will help you make sense of the madness, of the repetition, of the fights and conflicts that you have with your spouse around your sexual relationship? And to that end, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast episode is because we want to invite folks to explore these ideas in much more depth by attending the third annual Sexual Attachment Conference, which you and I are doing Friday, May 5th and Saturday, May 6th. So in the past, it's only been on Saturday. This year, it's going to be Friday evening into Saturday. So it'll take place over Zoom, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, May 5th, and then 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Saturday, May 6th. So let's just outline what we're going to address during this conference this year, Jay. Can you tell people what's going to happen Friday night? Because it's going to be a little bit different than last time.
Yeah. So I think our best language to talk about Friday night is that you and I are both psychotherapists, which means that we are more naturally inclined, potentially biased, to think about how our family of origin and individual stories shape our relationship to sex and desire. But for this year's event, we want to continue to address those important factors, but also broaden it to address the systemic factors that shape how we have been conditioned to think about and respond to sex. And that's why we're inviting Sheila Ray Gregoire, author of The Great Sex Rescue, to lead us on Friday night in thinking about how do our popular church and cultural messages contribute to sexual problems like a lack of intimacy, the orgasm gap, and a lack of mutuality and respect. So Sheila's work has surveyed about 22,000 women to unlock why, what makes some marriages flourish and others lead to misery. So I think, especially in the Christian world, we can be guilty of conceptualizing sex through a male centric lens where women are believed to be anything from not as sexual. They're required to be the gatekeeper to sex prior to marriage, and then led to believe that their husbands might use porn if they are not getting enough sex. So tragically, there are dozens of messages like this that we have internalized that then lead to problems with marital intimacy later in life. But there are also cultural assumptions that Sheila will address, anything from deprioritizing female safety, pleasure, and a holistic understanding of sex. One of the things that I read in The Great Sex Rescue that she cites is that when you go to PubMed to find articles mentioned on things like erectile dysfunction, there were over 40,000 articles on erectile dysfunction, but only 4,000 articles on dyspareunia. And so even if we looked at, just the research dollars that go into investigating male sexual problems versus female sexual problems, it is absurd. So Sheila is going to help us see where we have made some wrong turns and then redirect us to get back on track to a more robust vision of sex. So I am really, really excited for her to be part of this year's conference on Friday.
Yeah, and this is a really big deal because we're not just products of our family of origin. Our brains have not only been shaped by our family of origin, our brains, especially for those of you that identify or that grew up in kind of evangelical contexts, have been profoundly influenced by the kind of Christian cultural milieu that you bathed in, some of you from youth group on up. And part of Sheila's research and part of Sheila's gift to the world is to really prophetically expose some of what I would say the kindest way to say this would be the patriarchal consequences that are really causing a lot of misery in marriages. Perhaps a more accurate way of saying it is when you quote those two the distinction between the erectile dysfunction research and research into female sexual problems and the disparity of it. That is flat out diabolical. Is it patriarchal? Of course. But it's very dark. I mean, there is an assault on female sexuality. I don't know how else to say it, especially in the Christian world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've invited Sheila to come in and to put some language to, and really to prophetically, which what she does, to prophetically expose some of the dynamics that are informing how we have sex and how we view our sexuality, both as women and men. And it matters.
And one thing I would say to that is I remember going through a very popular Christian book that really encouraged people to, bounce their eyes or slap a rubber band around their wrist. And that's what I remember from that book. But when Sheila began to engage, portions of that book, one of the things that she found was there was a line that was pretty much verbatim, like, when your husband is trying to outgrow porn, you need to present your body as a merciful vial of methadone to him. Again, that is going to create madness in a marriage, entitlement, abuse within a marriage. And so I don't even remember reading that line because I am a male. So what I remember is I need to slap
Gotcha.
a rubber band around my wrist. And so that was one of the things that, you and I have just recognized with this is like, yes, we have a good perspective on this, but there are certain things that we do not even notice, that we are numb to just because of how we approach this topic as male psychotherapists. And so that's really what we're hoping for with Sheila, is to be able to share more stories, more insights, more research from, centering female sexual experience.
Yeah, so that's Friday night. On Saturday, let's go through Saturday. On Saturday, I'll begin the day by teaching about attachment. Attachment matters. It's a big deal. I'm going to talk about secure attachment, ambivalent attachment, avoidant attachment. How do you know which one you are? What does it mean if you're ambivalently attached or avoidantly attached? And then I'll go into an explanation of what I call the big 6 things that each child needs from their parents to develop a secure attachment. And if you don't have those 6 things adequately met during your growing up years, you will not develop a secure attachment. You'll either be avoidantly or ambivalently attached. And those 6 things, just in brief, are that you needed from your parents is you needed attunement, you needed responsiveness, you needed engagement, you needed your parents to be able to regulate your affect, you needed them to be strong enough to handle your big emotions, especially sadness, fear, and more than anything, you needed your parents to be willing to repair harm when they did it. So by looking at those 6 areas, you'll get a pretty good idea of how you attached to your parents. We will then move into an explanation of how your attachment style plays out in your sexual life, because it does. Your sexual difficulties now are largely a function of your attachment wounds, and your attachment style is very related to how you experience your sexuality. So to say it differently, securely attached people experience sexuality differently than avoidantly attached people and differently than ambivalently attached people. And we'll flesh all that out. In brief, just a few words now. When you're ambivalently attached, your sex life is largely about reassuring yourself that you're truly loved by your partner, that your partner's there for you. So, if your spouse says no to sex or says no to what you want to do sexually, you're likely going to experience some measure of panic. It may be mild, it may be severe. Why? Because as far as your nervous system is concerned, your partner's not only saying no to sex, they are communicating to you that they don't really care about you, they don't really care about your needs. They're not really there for you. And this triggers your anxiety that you can't rely on your partner to meet your needs and your wants. That's ambivalent in a nutshell with regard to sexuality. What about you avoidantly attached folks? Well, you're apt to avoid emotional closeness during sex with your partner. Sex per se may not be a problem for you. It's just sex with someone that you're in an emotionally committed relationship with, like a long-term partner or spouse. That's what's hard. Why? Why is it so challenging for you to enjoy sex with your spouse? Because you've got an emotional connection with that person. And so sex with them requires emotional intimacy and emotional closeness for you, if you're avoidantly attached, is frightening because it connects you to your unmet needs for emotional connection with your parents. So I know this is kind of 30,000 feet and maybe lots of words really fast, but the point is there is a linkage between your present sexual experience in your marriage and your past story. We want to make this conference as practical as possible. And so as a result, throughout the conference, Jay and I will be sharing some of our personal stories, and we'll share like vignettes that illustrate this linkage between the present and the past. After I teach on attachment and the Big Six, everyone's going to be given 30 minutes to do a written exercise that I've developed that is designed to help you get really particular in understanding what it was like for you in your family of origin with regard to these big six things. And this is a very important exercise. Why? Because the human brain does not change very much by receiving information. It changes far more by engaging in the particularities of your story in your family growing up and feeling the feelings that your body holds about those stories. And this Big Six exercise is designed to help you get clear about what it was like for you in your family, with your siblings, with your parents. So it's a very helpful exercise if you want to understand your story. After that, Jay, you're going to teach about family systems and how various forms of harm set us up for sexual difficulties down the road. Then I'm going to come on and talk about triangulation and subtle sexual abuse. I'll explain what those terms mean and why they matter for your sexuality as an adult. We'll have a lunch break. And then, Jay, you're going to do a section on why it's so difficult to change and some of the strategies that are embedded within sexual desire difficulties. In other words, what's the meaning of our unwanted sexual behavior, and what's the meaning? Why? How do we understand if our sexual life is one that's kind of better characterized as shut down and turned off? Then we're going to talk about the path to healing. What does change look like? What does growth? What does maturation look like? And after that, we will have the privilege of being joined by another guest speaker, happens to be your wife. Jay, say a little bit about what Heather is going to teach about.
Heather is going to be teaching primarily about low sexual desire. And, if we were to look at this broadly, Some marriage therapists would refer to this as every marriage is going to have a high desire sexual partner and a low desire sexual partner. And that doesn't mean that one is right or one is wrong. It just means this is inevitable. So, in Heather and I's marriage, if we were to think about this even outside of sex and just say social engagement or having friends over, Heather is the high desire social partner in our marriage. I am much more the low desire social person. And so, what theorists have found is that the low desire partner is the one that determines the frequency of sex. And that doesn't mean that the low desire partner likes that role. It just means that they desire sex less than, not because there's anything wrong with that necessarily, just because someone always desires more and someone always desires less. And so Heather is going to share some of just her experience of being the low desire partner in our marriage. And then she is also going to trace back that present story and reality to where some of those dynamics really began to get enforced in her family of origin and really help people engage these problems from a very curious approach. And so Heather will get into that. And I will also, as you mentioned earlier, get into some of the strategies of low desire, because a lot of times when we talk about sexual problems, we think about it as being excessive in nature, but low desire is very common. And so we want to bring some dignity and hospitality to the low desire partners out there. So, just a very brief preview of some of that would be for some people who have a low desire, that would be something of a form of protest. And so, if you are in a marriage where your no is not respected and your voice doesn't really feel like it matters, a no for sex might be the only no that you feel like you have left. And so, just that level of sometimes low desire could be a protest. For some people, their low desire would be a signal of past harm. Maybe if you went through some abuse early on in childhood, or there was something about your emotional availability that was always under scrutiny in your family, you may have realized that life goes a lot easier and there's less madness that I have to deal with if I just turn desire off. And so later in life, that will create marital difficulties where someone actually wants life and engagement, but your whole way of making your life work has been to lower desire and availability in order to avoid harm. And then finally, I would say, it could be low desire, could be something of a sign of sexual shame. And I think that this is particularly true for many of us who grew up in purity culture or with really harmful messages in the church, is that we kind of believe this lie that if we feel sexual arousal, if we feel sexual desire, there is something wrong within us. And then we begin to pair that experience of judgment and shame to arousal. So in, psychology, we talk about how the neurons that fire together wire together. And for many of us who grew up in purity culture, anytime the neurons of arousal began to fire, we began to feel some level of judgment. And so when we get into a marriage and we feel a desire to really be free in a sexual relationship, anytime we feel that level of freedom or desire, something in our bodies tells us like this is not okay and we need to shut that down further. So, Heather and I are hopefully going to do some really good work to be able to, yeah, just talk about the wisdom of the body in when it needs to say no or when it doesn't really desire much.
So let's end today by just talking a little bit about who this conference is for. Like, how do I know if it would be helpful for me to attend?
So, if you are an individual looking for a safe and wise place to be able to explore your sexual story, and you realize that you've never been invited nor asked to see your sexual story, we would love for individuals to come. We mentioned earlier that about 75% of marriages don't feel like they can talk about their sex life openly. We would love for a lot of couples to go through this conference together. And finally, I would just say if you are a leader, you are a pastor, a therapist, a lay leader, someone who is in some leadership position, we would love to have you join us. And one of the reasons for that is, most of us as leaders have not received the education that we need to be able to equip people to understand their sexual stories. So, most seminaries, most grad schools only require one course in human sexuality in the entire course of their training. Part of what Adam and I and Sheila and Heather are going to be working through is really providing additional language, additional wisdom to be able to help equip people to work redemptively with regard to people's sexual stories. And so there's this notion that we talk a lot about in psychology that just says no leader can take anyone further than they have gone themselves. And so we want to help leaders get healthy, help them get curious about their own stories so that they are more effective in leading others.
So the Sexual Attachment Conference will be Friday, May 5th through Saturday, May 6th over Zoom. It's our hope that it will help you connect the dots between the sexual difficulties you face now and your growing up years in your family of origin. We're going to talk about family systems, sexual arousal, how to transform your sexual story, and you can sign up by going to sexualattachment.com, or you can go to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and there's a link there. So sexualattachment.com or adamyoungcounseling.com. And I think the last thing I want to just say to folks kind of pastorally is, like, you are a sexual being. And your sexuality matters to God. And God is aware that your sexual story is filled with shame, with arousal, with hopes, with disappointments, with agonies, with delights. I mean, it is fraught. And so few of us have spaces where we can explore, engage, even just notice like what we feel about our sexuality. And one of the reasons, Jay, that you and I are doing this is because that pisses us off. We want to create a space for people to be able to explore their sexual selves and their sexual stories. Anything you want to add, Jay?
Yes, I would just say we would be so honored if you would join us for a day and a half to be very curious about your sexual story. And as Adam mentioned, sometimes these areas are fraught with a lot of shame and judgment. But our hope is that when you complete this conference, that you would leave with a sense of possibility, a sense of curiosity, and really a sense of hope with regard to your sexual story.
Good words, Jay. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been good to be with you.
So good to be with you as well, Adam. Thank you.